Well, here we are at the end of our study on the book of Titus, a small 3-chapter book that packs a lot of punch into its words. As we've moved through the book, there's one major theme that continues to ring true. There is an urgent truth, the gospel, that must be understood, lived, and protected. This truth has colored every paragraph we've looked at in chapters 1 through 5. It was the story of Paul that gave us the backdrop of the book. It was the reason he left Titus in Crete. It was for the sake of the elect. And in the next section, Paul describes the qualifications of an elder, not a deacon, an elder who is to be marked by the gospel, characteristics defining him that flow from the gospel. And he's to be a teacher of sound doctrine, which comes from the gospel. Then in closing chapter 1, we learn that those that teach contrary to the sound doctrine and the gospel of God are detestable, disobedient, and unfit for any good work. Chapter 2 told us how to interact and relate with those within the church and how it needs to accord with sound doctrine. We were taught how generations should be able to interact and learn from one another as the gospel is their shared focus. And then last week in the first half of chapter 3, we learned that the gospel has to be the basis of our interactions with those outside the church as well. For we were once sinners, but now we are redeemed people of God because the gospel is urgent and truthful. Now we turn to the final portion of Titus, where once again Paul doubles down on the idea of truth and those who would divert attention away from it. This section works as a reminder to Titus of the importance of understanding the implications of the gospel, but also the application of the gospel. First, Paul will discuss once again the need to stay focused on a goal. Much like our discussion a few weeks ago about weight loss and fitness, there are a lot of distractions out there and we must stay locked on our goal. Paul says as much to Titus in the opening part of this section, and he then proceeds to close the letter in a traditional exhortation. But this just isn't some random collection of pleasantries. It's a direct application of the gospel Paul's been addressing for Titus to stay focused on. The imperative for us is to stay focused on the urgent truth, because it's very easily to become distracted. It's very easy to get distracted. I literally fight it every day. There are plenty of things that I need to accomplish every day, but also a bunch of television shows I want to watch and movies I want to see as well. But when we're talking about biblical doctrine and the life-changing gospel, there's zero room for distraction, because distraction, if left unchecked, can have eternal consequences. The reason we must stay engaged in the fight for truth is that there are people who are divisive, even in churches. These people seek to undermine the impetus of the gospel by wanting to distract with various non-essential matters. Paul describes them as foolish controversies and genealogies, dissensions, and quarrels about the law. He then follows up with this and calls these attempts unprofitable and worthless. In previous sessions, we discussed the need to hold close-fisted doctrines and open-handed conversations. And there is a place and a time to discuss open-handed issues. However, what Paul's saying here is when open-handed issues become the doctrine that you uphold within a church, or someone continuously tries to make an issue, they're being divisive. And that's worthless and unprofitable. Paul does not mince words as to how to deal with this type of person. People intentionally attempting to be divisive have to be dealt with appropriately. The urgency of the truth of the gospel is infinitely more valuable than coddling someone's ego. As a leader in the church, Paul tells Titus to warn the divisive person once, and if they fail to repent, have nothing to do with them, for they're warped, sinful, and self-condemned. Paul's reference here is a model for church discipline, something that is lacking in modern churches. It's a reiteration of what Jesus taught on the matter in Matthew 18:15 through 17, where he says, "If your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. If he listens to you, you have gained your brother. But if he does not listen, take one or two others along with you, that every charge may be established by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. If he refuses to listen to them, tell the church, and if he refuses to listen even to the church, let him be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. It seems counterintuitive to the gospel to disregard certain persons because of their actions. However, in the process of church discipline, grace is always being offered. And it's the imperative of the one at fault to recognize and receive that grace or be rejected. The reasoning for this is simple. The gospel is too urgent of a truth to let fall into the hands of those that would try to detract from it. Put simply, if you're not living the gospel, you run the risk of being one who becomes divisive and therefore must be checked. Paul moves from here to the final traditional exhortation that the direct application of the gospel and its truth in our lives. What good is truth if there's no practical application for it? The short answer is it's good for nothing. Note here how Paul gives practical hands and feet actions to the truth of the gospel. Though often these closing remarks in pastoral epistles seem to be relatively toss-away sections that can't possibly apply to a modern audience, let me plead with you that they are not. In this section, we can see 2 things: the model for church planting and replicating, and the practical application reiterated from other sections of the letter. First, Paul encourages Titus to take care of those of the same gospel mind when they come through his area and eventually make his way back to Paul. Second, he also tells them to make sure that his people left to his care, the ones he's been entrusted with, devote themselves to good works, and we'll deal with each of these in succession. Paul tells Titus that he's going to be sending 2 people to him, and when he does that, Titus should make his best efforts to return to where Paul's at, the place where he's spending the winter. Undoubtedly, this is a succession plan that Paul's working through for the churches of Crete. He's sending Artemas and Tychicus to Crete, and when Titus returns to him, there's an implication that he'll be asked to head somewhere else to plant and or mentor another church that's being established. This is what the New Testament church should be doing, following the model of Paul. He went and he established churches and left and planted new churches in other needy areas. With a trusted cohort of like-minded people, he was able to ensure that the urgent truth of the gospel was protected and that this gospel was reaching from Judea to Jerusalem to Samaria and to the end of the earth. But let's be clear, the imperative for good gospel preaching churches has not ended and is as important, if not more important, in the 21st century as it was in the first century. There's also a missions focus when he instructs Titus to ensure that Zenas and Apollos lack nothing and to send them on their way with speed. These visiting missionaries had a destination and a need for support from the local church to accomplish their goal. The emphasis on a mission-minded congregation is not new, but a tenet of the first century church. Paul closes his letter with a simple instruction. Let our people learn to devote themselves to good works. This has been at the forefront of his discussion since he started talking about the gospel in chapter 2. Christians are not to be saved by good works, but they are saved to good works, and as such they must be devoted to doing them. It reiterates what James wrote in his letter to the early church when he said this, "What good is it, my brothers, if someone says he has faith but does not have works? Can that faith save him? If a brother or sister is poorly clothed and lacking in daily food, and one of you says to them, 'Go in peace, be warmed and filled,' without giving them the things needed for the body, what good is that? So also faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead. But some of you will say, 'You have faith and I have works. Show me your faith apart from your works, and I will show you my faith by my works.'" If our lives are to be marked by the gospel, the urgent truth that Paul desperately wanted to guard, then good works must follow. They must be the evidence of the righteousness that we've been clothed with, and they should be showing no preference to anyone, inside the church or outside the church, but loving everyone through the same grace that saved us. As we conclude, we go all the way back to our first point of pastoring our families. What would our families look like, whether with kids out of the house or just starting with them? If we started to show them our good works, love them through grace, and guard their hearts with the truth of the gospel. This is our imperative as God's stewards of our family, and it's a huge responsibility that cannot be taken lightly. As we end the book of Titus, I leave you with the final words of Paul to Titus. Grace be with you all.